Good afternoon. If I could welcome you. I'm Ralph Hexter. I'm Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor. I want to welcome you all to the second lecture in our series, the Provost Forum on the Public University and the Social Good. We're extremely pleased to have as our distinguished speaker today Professor Roger Geiger, who will discuss the past and future of the innovative university. Professor Geiger's presentation, which I was privileged enough to see in an early draft, is both thought-provoking and informed by his deep knowledge of the history of American higher education. This sort of historical grounding is essential if we are better to understand the tradition of the public university today and its possibilities for the future. I vow to keep my introductory remarks brief, as I know that we are all eager to hear Professor Geiger, but I do want to provide a little context for those of you who may not be familiar with the goals of this lecture series. As everyone here knows, the University of California is in the midst of one of the most critical periods in its history. For the past several years especially, the 10 UC campuses have faced extremely difficult choices as they attempt to cope with sharply diminished funding in the state of California, inevitably determining the right way to respond to this more austere economic climate has proved a formidable challenge, as well as a source of passionate debate within the UC system and beyond. At the center of the debate is the question of what the University of California and any public university should and can be in the 21st century. Since the campus events on and around November 18th, 2011, the topic has assumed a special relevance, especially here at UC Davis. In response, the Office of the Chancellor and the Office of the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor have committed to facilitating an inclusive and productive dialogue in the future of the public university that is so important for all of us. As part of this commitment, our two offices have established a web page residing on my website in support of lectures, panels, forums, and other campus events designed by, offered for the benefit of the UC Davis community. In addition, to complement other campus events, my office established the Provost Forums on the Public University and the Social Good. This focused scholarly series is aimed at furthering awareness and dialogue on this important topic within and beyond the university community. It is also aimed at exploring the potential to make UC Davis a center for the study of the role of the public university in contemporary society. This academic year, the series features 8 public presentations by expert speakers, plus associated events. The presentations are overseen by my office in cooperation with the university's Center for Regional Change. To learn more about the Provost Forum, I invite you to consult the Future of the Public University page on my website. There you'll find a complete calendar of the 8 lectures scheduled for 2012-13, advertisements and supplementary materials for each event, and videos of past events. You'll also find my opening remarks for the inaugural forum held in October 2012, which addressed the tasks before us as we attempt properly to envision the public university of the 21st century. So before I yield the podium, a few thanks. First and foremost to Professor Geiger for traveling to our campus to share with us his deep knowledge and thoughtful analysis. Next, to our Oversight Committee for their excellent work in arranging this and the other forums in the 2012-13 academic year. The committee's members are Martin Kenny, David Campbell, Jonathan London, and Luis Eduardo Guarniza, and Program Manager Alicia Thompson. To the co-sponsors with my office of today's event, the Community and Regional Development Program and the Center for Regional Change. And finally, to all of you for being here today on a Friday afternoon. This series is intended not only to be smart and informative, but also critically useful to the larger dialogue on the public university. Your participation in these forums and your subsequent sharing of what you hear here with others is a key mechanism by which the series will help us identify and clarify issues, formulate effective solutions, and create consensus among stakeholders. As I step away, I'll remind you that you're all invited to remain for a reception in this room immediately following the lecture. And now I yield the podium to Professor Kenny, who will introduce Professor Geiger. Thank you.
So, first I should thank Provost Hexter for providing support to making these fora possible, and Talisha Thompson for her invaluable and incredible efforts to organize this event and keep it running on time. Third, we would like to announce that there is a third event in this series, Making the People's University, Exploring the Civic Mission of the Public Land-Grant Universities and Cooperative Extension on February 22nd. So please watch for that. That'll be an exciting event. It is my great pleasure to introduce, brought some of his books. I couldn't find two other books that are lost in my mess, but it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Roger Geiger, whose work on the research university has really helped inform my thinking about universities. I've been a fan of his work for nearly 2 decades. Our committee thought that he would be an ideal person to come give us his views and inform us from the historical perspective about the public university and the social good. He's a distinguished professor of higher education at the Pennsylvania State University, former head of the higher education program. He's without a doubt the foremost scholar in this area. He's the author of innumerable articles, books, editorials, and other writings about the American university. Most notable for me are his books on the American Research University in the 20th century. The two I really like to highlight are To Advance Knowledge, the Development of the American Research Universities, 1900 to 1940. That's one of these. And Research and Relevant Knowledge, American Research University since World War II. These are classics. If you're interested, you should read them. More recently, in 2 books, Tapping the Riches of Science and Knowledge and Money, Research Universities and the Paradox of the Marketplace. It's just a very excellent book, examining the dilemmas and conundrums that research universities face in a time when research results can be transformed into large capital gains. And they face increasing pressure to commercialize these results. Today he's writing a history of the American university that we're all looking forward to reading. He's promised me it will be about 400 to 500 pages. I immediately assumed it would be 800 to 1,000. But he's promised me no, so we can read it in a weekend or so. To provide some measure of how comprehensive his interests are, the titles of 2 of his recent edited works are The Land-Grant Colleges and the Reshaping of American Higher Education, and Higher Education for African Americans Before the Civil Rights Act, 1900 to 1964, both of which are in his annual series, Perspectives on the History of Higher Education. I could continue listing his achievements, but I think it would be better to hear from Professor Geiger. So without further ado, I present Professor Geiger.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. I teach in a higher education program, and students in higher education in my program and elsewhere probably know me best for an article that I did called The 10 Generations of American Higher Education. And we're going to try to, I'm going to try to communicate here to get the PowerPoints. I think you have to do it one more time. The premise of this, well, the reason that it's my best known piece is because it's been anthologized and it's assigned in students' classes as kind of an overview of the history of American higher education. Well, the premise of this, which first draft I wrote a long time ago, was that about every 30 years, it seems like, there are major changes, not just in one aspect of higher education, but really sort of across the board. And that by arranging it in these generations, I was able to sort of ask good questions about, well, if this changed, what else changed? And change over time is really what history is all about. And change over time is something that's very difficult to identify in ongoing institutions, which sometimes look like they're not changing. But of interest today is, of course, Generation 10, which began with changes that took place in and around 1980. And what happened then? Well, these changes are sometimes not abrupt, sometimes they take some time. The dynamics of enrollments in higher education changed from about 1975 to the early 80s. The financing of higher education changed abruptly beginning in 1978. And for what we're talking about today, the involvement of universities in the commercial economy, the changes were long in coming, but they were symbolized by events that took place in 1980. Well, and really touched off what I'm calling today the innovative university, in that it's innovations that the commercial economy looks to the university for. And of course, if the 30-year timetable holds, then the Generation 10, the current era, is at the end of its rope. Important changes should be taking place around 1910, and in fact, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So this is what my talk is about. It's the changes that have taken place in the innovative university during the current era, and what we might expect in the years to follow. Now, to appreciate the current era and why it is really a substantial break from the past, you have to look back at the prior period, and particularly the developments during the dismal 70s. The dismal 70s were characterized by retrenchment, by disenchantment with higher education, budgetary pressures. But the 70s really represented the end of three of the strongest secular movements of the mid-20th century. It was the end of demographic expansion and enrollments in higher education, and the culmination of a growing publicness of higher education as a whole, and as well as the consolidation of vastly expanded federal responsibilities for research. The 1960s was the most expansive decade in the history of American higher education. But this growth slowed after 1970 and stopped after 1975. And you can sort of see the representation there. As of 1975, for the first time in our nation's history, enrollments in higher education ceased to grow. And they did not grow appreciably for another 2 decades at least. And this stagnation was accompanied by an alienation from academic culture. There was a huge defection from the liberal arts and sciences and from education too, towards vocational subjects, particularly business majors. A weak job market that depressed the wage premium received by college graduates led to exaggerated charges of overeducated Americans. Pundits extrapolated worse conditions ahead. The current era is known for privatization, but we don't have a word for the opposite of privatization. But that's really what occurred from 1945 to 1980. American states poured enormous resources into building public systems of higher education. Flagship universities, regional universities, public urban universities, community colleges. The public share of total enrollments, which was 1/2 in 1950, reached 79% in 1975. The 70s are perceived to be a time of financial hardship. Retrenchment was the watchword, but real public funding actually increased until the last years of the decade, reaching its highest level ever for per student outlays in 1977. And that's kind of a depressing fact. Real tuition at public universities declined modestly or increased less rapidly than inflation in those years, and moreover, the education amendments of 1972 provided a huge new infusion of public funds for higher education. The opposite side of this growing publicness was the perilous condition of the private sector. There was widespread concern that public colleges and universities were going to go out of business. The financial aid legislation of 1972 was specifically designed to keep the private sector afloat. Private colleges and universities experimented with ways to become more affordable, more vocational, or more accessible to a broader clientele. Private tuitions were stable for the decade relative to family incomes. This figure is a remarkable illustration of what I'm talking about. This is from Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz, The Race Between Education and Technology, which just by the way is one of the most striking testimonies to the social good that higher education can bring. But you see that from 1950 to 1980, public tuition and private tuition were stable in terms of median family income. And beginning in 1980, it abruptly shot upward. And this graph leaves out the last 10 years. So if you put that in, it's off the chart. So the last years of the 70s really represented the high water mark for public support for higher education and the apogee of access of U.S. students to low-cost, well-furbished, publicly supported post-secondary education. And interestingly, low cost and wide availability did not sustain enrollment growth. Public funding for access was not accompanied by public confidence in higher education. In fact, everywhere the social expenditures began to be challenged. Internationally, this was called the crisis of the welfare state. Still, no one in these years foresaw a resurgence of private higher education. Let me turn to research then. Burgeoning federal support for university research created a golden age for a decade after the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957. Expenditures for academic research flattened out from 1968 to 75 and then rose only modestly until the mid-80s. More significantly, there was a great deal of pessimism surrounding the academic research enterprise. Federal agencies, taking their cue from politicians, sought practical results from research investment. Universities took the money but did not embrace the practical goals. After being hammered for performing defense research, they generally harbored an ivory tower mentality, preferring pure academic research. They were thus doubly frustrated by the contraction of funding and by the redirection of federal research. Ties with industry were sparse, with a few exceptions, but overall industry supported just over 3% of academic research. So in sum, the forces that had long sustained these three vast historical movements were by the end of the 1970s pretty much exhausted. And moreover, the premises on which they had mobilized people and public spending were now being challenged. An additional wild card was the inflation that raged from 1978 to 1982, raising the cost of living by 50%. But rapidly rising prices drove home a sense of crisis and encouraged a willingness to try new things. So what happened around 1980? Several largely unrelated developments set in motion forces that transformed the way we finance higher education. These were the ramping up of federal student loans on a large scale and the start of tuition discounting. Federal student loans really took off with something called the Middle Income Student Assistance Act of 1978, which made guaranteed student loans available to everyone regardless of income. And a lot of people took advantage of this, and loans quickly mushroomed, doubling to $9 billion from 77 to 1980. But even when income caps were reimposed in 1981, loans didn't go down, but they kept on growing, and they've been ratcheting upward ever since. Higher education had tapped into a new source of revenue, the future earnings of its students, and it would only encourage the Sloan culture that this had spawned. 1978 was also when Harvard University made a policy decision to boost its tuition price by 18%, or $700, which was unprecedented at that time, and in compensation to increase student financial aid with internal funds. Well, to make a long story short, no price resistance surfaced, and they kept raising their tuition by large amounts, and so did all their competitors. The entire private sector in the 1980s adopted this practice of tuition discounting or differential pricing. The genius of these two practices soon became apparent. By subsidizing the most price-sensitive students with discounts and loans, tuition could be raised without affecting demand. The policy of high tuition, high aid was adopted throughout the private sector, and of course eventually leaked into the public sector. And it was one important factor in reversing the decline of private higher education. In the 1980s, private institutions began to outperform public universities, and that trend has strengthened since then. So the trend in loans and tuition discounting have not only persisted but intensified in recent years. Student loan debt is, now exceeds $1 trillion, more than all credit card debt, and more than state appropriations for higher education or all tuition income. Moreover, it's quadrupled in the last 8 years. And tuition discount in the private sector now average 42%. So if you think about this, would anyone devise a policy for financing higher education in which shaky student loans would be the largest source of funds? Would any institution adopt a tuition policy that yielded 58 cents on the dollar? These policies, once set in motion, developed according to their own momentum. In one case driven by market logic, in the other by defects in the federal student loan policy. The other side of this coin is the disinvestment by states in public higher education. The rising percent of tuition incomes is painted by this picture, and this is another way of expressing it. So state universities really cannot engage in tuition discounting for several reasons. Basically, they have too few affluent students. Their students have relied instead on federal loans to meet the rising tuitions, which is one large factor in the quadrupling of outstanding loans. So the issue of rising costs in higher education is a much larger topic. My point here is that the funding that made this rise possible, namely differential pricing and student loans, were artifacts of the current era. And that today, at the end of that era, their sustainability is very much in doubt. Another necessary condition for this was what I call the selectivity sweepstakes. And here you have to realize that in the private sector in the 1970s was trying to cut costs and reduce tuition. They were worried about that they didn't have pricing power. This changed after 1980s with tremendous marketing efforts in the public sector, and in 1983, a catalyst of sort was the first ranking of colleges by U.S. News and World Report. These rankings not only proved enormously popular, but soon had a significant effect on the number of applications, the yield of matriculating students, and the amount of financial aid needed to recruit a class. So this, too, was part of the changing enrollment dynamics of higher education. So how do these factors affect the innovative university? Well, basically, they threaten the business model of the American research university. It's becoming increasingly obvious to people who look at these things that this is the case. Ronald Ehrenberg, the economist at Cornell, has written as much as anyone about this, posed the question in a recent paper: is the golden age of private research university over? His answer is that the financial model that private research universities operate under is under great stress and is breaking down. And of course, privates are a lot better off than the publics. The factors he cites have been around a long time. Tuition rising by 3% above the CPI for 30 years, tuition discounts above 40%, the crunch in funding research, and administrative bloat. But now he foresees these pressures will dictate fundamental changes. For another opinion, Moody's recent assessment of the higher education sector reported that the pricing power of colleges has reached an inflection point where higher tuition is no longer increasing net tuition. For another opinion, The Economist has chimed in, declaring American universities represent declining value for money to their students. It foresees a trend towards the unbundling of higher education, which would not be a good thing for Clark Kerr's multiversity. And in last week's Science, Norman Augustine listed all the factors, the disruptive factors that are affecting and potentially affecting higher education. And then he made reference to the aerospace industry, which he was a CEO for. And the title of his article is, "We Never Saw It Coming." So there's almost a consensus out there that these forces that are pressuring the research university and the research university model are coming to a head. For public universities, last year, 2 major government reports warned of an impending crisis, and chiefly caused by the long contraction of state support. Well, this is one expression of state support, and these are the 2 reports that that articulate this problem. Of course, these reports come out periodically, and they tend to articulate the same problem, but they're kind of like benchmarks, you know, to measure where we are. The great fear is that the lack of state support for public universities, it will lead to a decline of their capacity to support graduate education and research. So I'll come back to that, but first I want to look at the research universities as sources of innovation. My focus here is the input of university research to technological innovation and what is called in the profession TBED, technology-based economic development. And if invention is the first emergence of an idea for a new product or process, innovation is a successful effort to carry it out in practice. In some ways, this ranks innovation above invention. William Baumol, the venerable economist, has argued that virtually all of economic growth that has occurred since the 18th century, that's a lot, is ultimately attributable to innovation. Oddly, innovation only emerged as a topic of academic interest in the 1970s, but it has really taken off in the late 1990s. Well, for universities, there are really 2 tracks of innovation. Baumol emphasizes the first one, this corporate track. It's innovation that takes place in corporate laboratories. Most of our industries operate under conditions of oligopolistic competition. Mature, high-tech industries largely consist of a handful of dominant large corporations that compete only obliquely with one another. By constantly developing new and improved products, they differentiate their goods and services from those of their rivals. The universities have long played a role in this track for innovation by providing scientific assistance for the efforts of corporate labs. But that contribution has been and still is rather limited. The second track of innovation is the one that really took off after 1980. And it's inventions that produce new products or processes. This track operates largely through patents and licenses. And the commercialization of new inventions entails both market risk and technological risk. They are typically commercialized by smaller companies or startups, which are less risk averse than large corporations. For example, 16% of university licenses are taken out by startups, and 54% are taken up by small companies, leaving only 30% of licensed by large corporations. So universities in the past, before 1980, were only marginally involved in this track with occasional serendipitous inventions. And in fact, the Research Corporation administered most of those academic patents. The university's role in these three innovation tracks was revolutionized around 1980. And a very good book has just come out called Creating the Market University, how academic science became an economic engine. And these are the three areas that the author Elizabeth Berman looks at. These are areas that Martin Kenny and I have both written about a great deal. But she analyzes the background in an interesting way. And she describes how people were attempting to develop these areas for a long time, but universities were really not interested in cooperating for a number of reasons. What changed around 1980, she found, was the rise of an innovation policy frame in those years that blamed the country's declining economic competitiveness on lack of innovation and advocated technology transfer as part of the solution. Around 1980, this became the consensus, and a number of laws changed to make this possible. Of course, the decisive change in patenting was the famous Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which directed universities to patent discoveries made through federally funded research. But this was accompanied by a creation of a more favorable patenting environment, particularly for biotech. Biotechnology was, of course, the great scientific revolution of those years. But its development was facilitated as well by government decisions. The government was going to regulate the field, but then backed off and did not. There's an important court case that legalized the patenting of living organisms. And in 1980, the enterprise model of Genentech received spectacular validation with a Wall Street IPO. Now in the corporate innovation track, new ground was broken by NSF's Industry University Cooperative Research Programs and then by the engineering research centers. So the government has always been interested in promoting this kind of innovation. And these were accompanied by a number of state programs aimed at promoting university industry cooperation. These developments might be said to have launched the innovative university. And my book with Crezo Sa, Tapping the Riches of Science, brings this story up to the eve of the Great Recession. Now Berman notes that the transformation of the 1980s, there have been, well, she says that fairly few new mechanisms have come out, but there have been some developments. Basically, in the inventive track, public policies have emphasized helping inventors make the transition over what's known as the valley of death, which is going from a proof of concept to a working prototype that people can actually invest in. And they've done this by subsidizing arrangements for pre-business incubators in order to develop inventions, by trying to involve entrepreneurs and venture capitalists at an early stage to help these things along. MIT, the Deshpande Center, has probably been the leader there. And an effort to provide managerial assistance to startup companies. Similarly, in the corporate innovation track, federal and state policies have done a good deal to strengthen this track. The Engineering Research Center program has been renewed twice. It's in its third generation now. The NSF and a number of other federal agencies require corporate partners for many of their larger grants. Some state programs provide direct assistance for research professorships. And state policies to seed university industry research centers have been prominent in those states. So what have been the results? For corporate sponsorship of research, the changes after 1980 were dramatic. Corporate contributions to total academic research rose from 3% to 6% in the 1980s and then edged up to 7% by the end of the century. However, at that point, this long secular expansion of corporate-sponsored university research faltered. For the first time ever, it actually went into a downtrend. And it went down for a while, went up again, and then has headed down and is probably stabilizing now. But the point is that this growth has been broken. And there's no systematic explanation for this pattern. In fact, given the kind of public support for corporate university interactions, it seems like it should be increasing. The trend in industry is open innovation. And these are some of the reasons given for it. For this, there's a conflict over intellectual property rights. Corporations are investing a lot more overseas, but the balance of trade in research greatly favors the United States. And there are inherent limitations to corporate demand for university research. But I think that this last one is competition from other institutions is most important. And here, this only covers up through 2005, but you can see that during this period of contraction in college and university performance, the corporations were contracting out to other industries. And where was this going? Well, university startups, for one thing, in areas like biotechnology, nanotechnology, they do much more focused research that corporations value much more. Then there are government programs like SBIRs, STTRs, which I'm not going to go into, but they provide government subsidies for this kind of research as well. So however, there's another dimension to this issue, and that is that although corporations are not doing a great deal of research with industry, they have a great deal of support for university research. In fact, university research has really benefited from the support of two strategic sources, industry and governors. The National Governors Association has been a cheerleader for university research since 2000 and for technology-based economic development. And industrial associations have supported it as well. If you want to know why the decision was made to double the NIH budget, that was 7 or 8 years ago, it's because there's a great deal of support in industry. And why is that? Well, here you can see the forms of corporate university research relationships, and they really cover a lot of things beyond industry-sponsored research. In fact, in a widely cited study, it was identified that the most important source of R&D information for industrial labs from universities was public science. That is, publications and conferences. The next most important source was interactions with individuals, and both informal interactions and also hiring students and so forth. So these kinds of relationships with industry are much more important than simply the amount of research that corporations support. Now, when it comes to invention patenting, that track of innovation, it's a little bit more difficult to analyze. And in fact, I hesitate to speak on this subject because Martin is developing a database that's going to tell us a good deal more about this. In our book, we looked at the metrics for measuring the patenting, licensing, and startups for coming out of universities compared to research dollars. And a fairly clear picture emerged. Up until 1998, or thereabouts, the output of intellectual property from universities was advancing faster than the inputs of university research. But then after 1998, the conditions seemed to stabilize, and outputs kept growing, but they were growing at the same rate as inputs of research, and perhaps not as fast as the inputs of technology licensing officers. For this talk, I carried this forward to 2011, and I found no change. These figures are almost meaningless, but basically there's still the same relationship that the outputs of patents and licenses keep growing, but pretty much in keeping with with research measured in constant dollars. So the I mean, the upshot of this is that while these national reports are saying how important it is for us to increase the innovation production of universities, it doesn't seem to be happening in terms of corporate research relationships, and we're certainly not increasing the output of patents and licenses beyond the inputs. So the question, what does all this mean then for the future of the innovative university? And here, being warned by such sages as Niels Bohr and Yogi Berra, I, of course, will be very modest. But how can we determine if 2010 is a change point, and that if the second decade of the 21st century represents a new era for higher education and the innovative university? Well, what I like to do as an historian is to try to identify large quantitative changes. They may not tell the whole story, but they tell you that something is happening. And so what are the changes that have been taking place in higher education? Well, one is the rise of for-profit higher education. And boy, if that isn't a rapid change from 4% to 13% in one decade, I don't know what is. Second change is online learning. And here, I don't need to present any statistics. You can pick up the Chronicle of Higher Education any day and read about the latest developments in online education and MOOCs. As novel as MOOCs are, I really don't think that they're the game changer. Rather, we should look at the continual expansion of online education. For example, Penn State has added 10,000 students in the last decade, all of them online. My own program, the higher education program, has a certificate program that we offer online. And it's been very successful. And why do we do it? Because online education is tremendously overpriced. And we earn money that we can use to support our doctoral students. And the big secret is that online education is simply way overpriced, and that's why that's one reason why it's growing fast and will keep growing until we get a Walmart of higher education to come along and offer it at a reasonable price. Third big change, contingent faculty. Now, you'll see a lot of statistics on so-called contingent faculty, but usually they include part-time faculty. And of course, there are enormous numbers of part-time faculty, and it's hard to know what they mean. What's more important is the growth of non-tenure track full-time faculty. And you can see that this covers from 92 to 2007, but the big growth is since 1999. It's after 2000, and in both public and private sector, that's where the growth in faculty is. There's almost no growth in regular faculty, which is a problem. Finally, there's the affordability crisis, and here student loan debt is the main problem. So I thought I'd express it with all the zeros so you could really appreciate it. And, but look, in 8 years, it's quadrupled. And if it keeps going at that rate, it would be $4 trillion in 2020, and it would probably equal the gross national product in 2030. This is an unsustainable growth. And what are we doing about it? Nothing. So, excuse me. So these are the kind of changes that have to be, these are the realities of what's happening in higher education. And the question is then, what do we do about it? Well, on the other side, we have sort of the hopes and the expectations of what we'd like to see happen in higher education. And these are best expressed as policy agendas. These are arguments advanced by policy communities and policy entrepreneurs seeking to advance or perpetuate their particular interests. For simplicity, there are different policy agendas for undergraduate education and graduate education and research. For undergraduate education, of course, greater affordability is wanted. Everybody wants more access. We want to improve student learning. I doubt if we could even, if we had an intelligent policy, could achieve two of the three. But the policy agenda for the academic scientific community for research and innovation, well, these are just statements from these two reports, and the keys to America's future is to reaffirm and revitalize the unique partnership that has long exhibited, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, these are serious arguments, and you know, they may be true for all I know. But once again, there's a problem in getting from where we are now to where these agendas would like us to be. Now, the most fundamental problem, I think, is that the traditional model of the research university is threatened, as I indicated. The ratcheting downward of state appropriations, the rise in tuition. The latest survey of freshmen reveals them to be the most cost-conscious and their behaviors more affected by costs than ever before. We are running into price resistance. And yet the latest survey of university business managers reported that their dominant strategy for both public and private universities was to increase net tuition revenues. So given the affordability crisis and crushing student debt, this seems unlikely, and Moody's thinks that too. So the increase in contingent faculty should be viewed as a symptom of the inability of universities to expand their faculties according to the traditional model. It is somewhat cheaper and more efficient to create purely teaching positions. But this situation is related to the growth of online learning and the affordability crisis. You don't need active scholars and researchers to provide online education. There can be no doubt that online learning has become a permanent part of higher education. The question still to be answered is, in the words of William Bowen, who gave a great talk on this, it's available, whether or not online learning in many of its manifestations can lead to good learning outcomes at lower cost. And after some initial skepticism, Bowen now believes that it can. My interest here is the impact of such a solution on university faculty. Most faculty did not become professors to perform the kind of tasks that an online format requires. And Bowman sees that and envisions a university in which faculty expend a great deal of their efforts in teaching activities. Now, this may appeal to some, but more ominous, where does the lower cost come from? Costs for technology, infrastructure, and support personnel will increase. The cost savings will have to come from the faculty. This might mean fewer faculty or contingent faculty, and it would certainly mean faculty dedicated to teaching. It's hard to see how this could be implemented without lessening the sum total of faculty expertise and learning in research universities. Now, this situation should be of concern for the research policy community. The figure showing the increase of contingent faculty, as I said, revealed the minimal growth of full-time tenure-track faculty in both public and private universities from 1992 to 2007, and it hasn't changed since 2007, I can tell you that. This core faculty they're the bearers of the expertise of the university, and they have increased less than total faculty, less than administrators, less than students, less than research funds, and less than the growth of knowledge. So this situation has created a bottleneck in the academic pipeline. In the humanities, it has long been evident in the lack of academic positions for new cohorts of PhDs. In the sciences, it's manifest in the growing length of postdoctoral appointments. Postdocs in biology is worse. Postdocs have increased by 25% in the last 10 years. The report, Research Universities and the Future of America, recommends strategies to accommodate young PhDs, but they depend on federal funding for federally endowed professorships. Don't hold your breath for that one. So the policies that are advocating greater innovation, greater research from our universities are also ignoring some realities. So the academic research economy is heavily dependent on federal funding, of course, and there are two possible scenarios there. The administration, the Obama administration has been very supportive towards academic research. And it probably will continue to be so. On the other hand, Congress wants to, if Congress were to establish a budget deal, it would probably cut funding across the board, and university research would take their lumps like everyone else. My best hope is that federal research support will remain stable for a while, making a few initiatives possible, perhaps with little funding behind them, and probably tilted towards industry needs. The momentum behind innovation and technology-based economic development, that is the ideological momentum, still remains very strong. And until these kinds of policies are questioned, additions to federal programs will continue to be oriented towards economically relevant academic science. So how will the innovative university cope with these conditions? In a nutshell, with undergraduate instruction and core funding under severe budgetary pressure, and research and graduate education benefiting from association with economic development, these two realms are likely to be pulled in opposite directions. The distinguishing feature of the trend in instruction is the growth in contingent faculty and online learning. The distinguishing feature of graduate education and research are found in centers and institutes, what the University of California called ORUs, Organized Research Units, and which Clark Kerr used to develop the academic superiority of the UC system. But the result is an increasing bifurcation of the faculty between those whose job is teaching and those devoted mainly to research and scholarship. And in a previous paper on this topic, I concluded by asking, how close are we to the tipping point that would radically undermine the traditional faculty role? I don't know, but 5 years later, we're closer than we were when I wrote that. The traditional role of a tenure-track university professor is unique in the amount of continual investment made by employers in human capital or intellectual growth. The quid pro quo, of course, is that these resources will be employed to develop a very high level of expertise in a specialized field, and to employ that expertise to advance the field through research and publications, sharing that knowledge with others through service, and in addition to teaching. Individuals who meet these criteria are rewarded with tenure, and the university continues to invest in their knowledge growth until retirement. universities do not invest in the intellectual growth of non-tenure track faculty. Thus, they fulfill a job, but they don't add to the overall learning and expertise of the institutions. The activities of research faculty at innovative universities have increasingly revolved around centers and institutes. And this trend should strengthen. Now, the original ORUs were characterized, the situation was characterized as being a core. The academic core consisted of academic departments, and ORUs, institutes, existed on the periphery. Such research has been criticized as being in silos and narrowing, and I can testify that there are inherent tendencies. I've been part of a center for my entire academic career, and there is an inherent tendency to specialize more narrowly on particular topics. However, the innovative university has tended to evolve away from this dichotomy and toward a greater integration in a matrix type of organization. If you think of a matrix in which the departments are the rows, the columns, the centers and institutes are the rows, and an individual would belong to one department and perhaps have joint appointments in other departments, and then participate in one or more centers or institutes as well. So filling different blocks in this matrix. Well, this model already exists in academic health centers, which consist of a maze of centers and institutes that interact with one another in multiple ways. Individual faculty teach very little and are associated with several units besides their principal home. As universities evolve towards greater research outputs, they too have evolved towards a matrix organization. Neil Smeltzer, in assessing the dynamics of American universities, has noted departments have been hollowed out as intellectual communities, but retain vitality as political entities. Smeltzer makes this point in building a larger argument that the dynamics of American universities have largely been governed by a process of structural accretion. By structural accretion, he means a composite form of growth through the incorporation of new functions over time without, however, shedding existing ones or splitting into separate organizations, which sounds pretty much like a university. As far as academic research is concerned, the most notable feature of the 21st century has been the incorporation of major new organizations designed to foster university research relevant to innovation. And so here I call them accretions. These are research institutes that were all established by state policy, except the last was founded by industry, assisted by the state. All of these, well, the federal research policy actually plays a larger role in advancing this trend. And these are major federal research centers since the year 2000. The top ones, those are called MERSECs. They date from 2000. The National Nanotechnology Initiative dates from 2003. These others are even more recent. But all of them represent huge investments. My own university, Penn State, has acted on this logic by creating a separate research structure to parallel the academic organization. 6 overarching institutes were formed to organize and coordinate research in the life sciences, materials, energy and the environment, social sciences, cyber science, and arts and humanities. These institutes have their own resources which they use to shape the direction of research in their particular area. Some of them have a lot of resources. The new building for the Materials Research Institute. Thus, research is no longer subject to the whims of academic departments. Rather, the institutes offer departments support for the hiring of faculty needed for interdisciplinary research teams. And the institutes then are able to structure the formation of specifically targeted centers. The institutes contain multiple centers which, unlike former silos, are strongly interconnected. The, my guess is that public universities, or at least some of them, will develop more rapidly towards a matrix structure. They have a greater capacity for acquiring science-based technology centers, and they have greater scope of research as well. And that is what seems to be important in the current research environment. Private universities are reluctant to commit to expanding their research infrastructure. They prefer smaller and more prestigious science departments. However, the size and scope demanded for interdisciplinary centers that federal agencies are promoting, private universities above all will tend to protect the elite character of their undergraduate colleges, since it is the source of their tuition revenues and alumni donations. But in the none of this applies to the biomedical sciences. They're NIH rules, and public, private universities, they all conform to the NIH culture. But in the physical sciences, computer science, engineering, there are a handful of truly outstanding private universities, but public universities perform 70% of the research in those areas. And it's there that public universities will probably dominate even further in the future. Looking forward, the great unknown is the issue raised by these national reports, whether or not the deterioration of state support will undermine the ability of public universities to function as these hubs of innovation. But let me conclude on an optimistic note. In fact, I will quote the rational optimist, Matt Ridley, who says that all human progress has depended on exchange. And it was when humans began to exchange that the human economic progress began. I like this argument, but if exchange is the key to human progress, there's no place better suited for the exchange of ideas than universities. This is something that Ridley misses, by the way. And the evolving matrix structure of centers and institutes is designed explicitly to accelerate this kind of exchange. American universities, in particular, require and assist their faculties to develop deep expertise in a multitude of subjects. They exchange constantly, not only with local colleagues, but with experts in related fields around the world. Thus, universities, above all, are repositories of advanced learning. In their most consequential actions, universities seek to maximize learning, the learning of faculty, the learning of students, the sharing of that learning with others in the ways that enhance the learning for all. This is the basis for the unique contribution of universities to the social good. My fear is that contemporary trends of diminished funding, of the substitution of contingent faculty or online learning, will erode the sum total of learning that universities have to offer, and hence their potential to contribute to the social good. On the positive side of the ledger, the promise of generating innovations for U.S. economy has brought universities resources to sustain the search for new learning. Going forward, if we don't screw up, this should be the greatest asset for the future of the innovative universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. We'll open the floor for questions, and why don't you just...
Yes, I'm really interested in hearing how things look at the University of California and on these issues.
Well, today's a sunny day, so everything looks good.
Oh, good.
I was hoping you'd say a bit more about organizational structure and innovation, and that's sort of a black box in your talk. What have we learned from history that would suggest either structures within universities that are more promoting of innovation or less successful?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if structures are most important.
Or incentives.
Culture is usually what people fall back on, and the culture supporting innovation or commercialization of innovation varies widely. So most universities have been very interested in trying to promote entrepreneurial behavior among their faculty, and so they hold workshops. Sometimes they give prizes. You know, it's not the monetary gains don't seem to be enough, but it's probably more. It's more developing expertise in specific areas, and you have to sort of go where the interests are. And at Penn State, they've been very successful in one of these institutes, the Institutes for Energy and the Environment, because so much interest in both energy and the environment, you know, and whether you're for or against either of those things. But they've got a lot of industry buy-in there. Well, so when you start studying really applied areas where there are practical spin-offs, I think that's when intellectual property is likely to result. And biotech, of course, is all by itself unique. Christina?
Yes, I like the presentation very much and the idea of universities as places of exchange. And I agree with you that one reason for the success of the University of California is that we had those organized research units. There is something that you were asking about the University of California that you didn't mention, and I always have believed was very important, and that is the graduate groups, which are interdisciplinary graduate programs. And I believe that Davis has the most interdisciplinary outlook in the entire country.
That's good.
Yeah, so I was interested in your analysis. I agree that that has been one of the strengths of the system. Mm-hmm. Now, with the economic crisis, of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but hopefully we'll be able to preserve this aspect of the university as a place of exchange.
Well, yes, that's, you know, this notion of matrix kind of structure is kind of predicated on doing interdisciplinary work and being able to be involved in research groups in different centers. And it's that kind of cross-cutting exchange that I think is essential. And that's what the funding agencies are looking for as well. That's how large questions have to be addressed as well.
Actually, one of the main functions of these centers is to act as intermediaries with the funds.
Sure.
That's how you do it. So that's an interesting function.
Mm-hmm.
I also very much like your presentation, and I'm intrigued by this 30-year chunks, and that you ended at 2010, right? And you're predicting or looking at the future.
Right.
Given what we're seeing now, it seems like most major research universities, public and private, are looking to further internationalize their efforts with brick-and-mortar campuses or partnerships or research centers or whatever it may be, and certainly connecting with industries globally. Is that going to be part of the next 30 years, or are the economics of that such that it really doesn't have much traction for the future?
I've never been able to understand the economics of that, or what makes it compelling. I can see how they can establish international branches that might be self-supporting, but they certainly don't add much. And so are you going to send your most valued faculty members overseas and lose them on your own campus, or do you hire people who aren't quite so good to do that? I'm not the person to ask for an explanation of that development, because I'm not really convinced of it.
But do you see it continuing for the next 10 or 20 regardless of the economics of it?
I see universities pulling back. In the Gulf states, a couple of universities have started initiatives and then withdrawn them. They just simply don't all make sense. I mean, there's something that you can do very cheaply. You can rent a floor of an office building in Singapore and offer some courses. It doesn't cost too much, but setting up a campus is a risky endeavor, and I think as financial pressures mount, university will be less eager to do that, or they're going to try to do it online, where there's a profit margin.
The innovative university with the tech licensing income that some believe are going to wipe away the deficits. When we look across universities, we don't see that tech licensing generates all of that money, particularly if you subtract off the costs. Mm-hmm. So is the innovative university that you're talking about a university that's going to do this through tech licensing? Or is the university more important, and we've done some research on, for example, UC Berkeley, the most important software programs that came out of Berkeley were never licensed, and were far more important to this state's economy than most of the things that were licensed. And so the innovative university can be an innovative university and throw the seeds of that knowledge out into the community and create wealth.
Absolutely.
Or it can try to control it and extract wealth from it, and so far, outside of a few universities and a few inventions, there just isn't that much money there. Because, the invention part is such a small part of actually getting a product into the market. And so, what is your innovative university? Is your innovative university the university that tries to collect pennies of each piece of knowledge that goes out, or is it something else?
Well, it's misleading to just focus on patenting. As I said, that's only one track of innovation, and it looks like we're squeezing about as much in terms of patents and licenses out of universities as we can, given.
Your graph shows that it's decreasing, in fact, more licenses and less income.
Yeah, well. That's possible. Looking at it, I found it difficult to see it going one way or another. But it's certainly it's not taking off. And of course, there's always this possibility of hitting the jackpot. So I mean, that's why people go to Las Vegas and maybe universities do a little bit. The big money is doing economically relevant research. It's getting these centers for materials research, for the National Robotics Initiative. And universities have to be really well organized, have a well organized research structure in order to compete for those things. But that's where the innovative university makes its biggest contribution. And universities have evolved in that direction because that's where the money's been coming from more and more since the 1980s. And so the cooperation with industry is kind of a byproduct of some of that. Inventions, startups and so forth as well, but it's the research that is the thing, and that has been extraordinarily successful. And and it looks like, I mean, unless the federal government begins to shut down, it looks like that's where the money is going to continue to come from. Andy?
So you started out the talk with around tuition in undergraduate education, and the role that tuition revenues are increasing playing in driving all that, and then subsequent things. But then we ended with the conversation around research dollars and organized research units. And I see those as actually inherently in conflict, back to your point of contingent teaching. Having been involved in matrix organizations in universities and in organizations, I can tell you that the one thing that does increase as you matrix an organization is the number of meetings you do, which takes away from both research and teaching. But I am curious, to the extent that universities do pursue more ORU centers, institutions, and get towards a research focus that is problem-based and across disciplines, they will inherently drift away from education, undergraduate education. Those faculty that are supposedly the engine of knowledge generation in universities.
Yes.
So aren't we, we are inherently seeing a future where those two conflict, right?
That's right. They're going in opposite directions. I mean, the base.
Or will they simply continue that way?
Well, universities, they develop it incrementally. We have people in Washington writing these wonderful reports, giving us national goals. Then we have the university business manager saying, how am I going to meet the budget for next year? And so with this incremental kind of development, research is doing fairly well, particularly economically relevant research. It's getting, bringing in centers, it's getting, some support from industry and so forth. So that part of the university keeps developing. The core funding of the university is in real trouble. And it's not just tuition, it's state funding. It's the fact that the profit centers of the university, the law schools and business schools are now sort of up against the wall in terms of a lack of enrollment growth and so forth. If that continues, we're going to keep sort of shortchanging undergraduate education by providing it on the cheap. We've got to find ways to do it more cheaply if the money isn't there. But the model for universities is to get more money to keep doing things the way we have been doing them. And what it looks like is that the money's not going to be there, and universities are not going to be able to keep doing things the way they have been. And that's sort of the real question for the next generation. Yes.
So, Roger, one of the historical antecedents to this whole series was the Occupy protests and the concerns for equity. And with that in mind, the most striking, graphs you showed were the student debt.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, from your vantage point, is anybody working on that? Any ideas, any new broad funding model possibilities that don't rely on this so much? Or what are you seeing there?
No, no one's doing anything as far as I know. I mean, there are a couple great injustices taking place here. One is that the for-profits with 12% of the students or something like that are taking one third of student loans. And that is just simply throwing money down the toilet. Not only that, it's worse than throwing money down the toilet because people are being burdened with, people have to go retrieve that money somehow or pay it back. And I mean, that's a public policy failure where there simply should be limits on the availability of loans for these for-profit schools. The other source is the exorbitant tuition in the private sector, so that students of upper middle class students who are very wealthy still have to borrow money. And then the other source is the fact that public university tuition has gone up, and it's so that the cost of higher education in a public university, residential, so far exceeds the median family income, that is expected family contribution, that most students are forced to receive financial aid. So That's not one of the issues that you hear our congressman talking about resolving.
At some point, it seems like if you look at it in terms of broad social costs, the costs of allowing that to continue is even greater than just lowering tuition.
Well, the Obama administration has tried to make the terms of the loans less onerous. I mean, that's about the only thing that's happened. But it is pretty onerous because you can't get out of it through bankruptcy. And, you know, there's stories in the paper all the time about, you know, the sob stories about students that borrowed much more than they should have.
Roger, thank you very much. Lots of questions, no easy answers. And,
That's right.
And I wonder, I don't have the answer, but on the other hand, I have to be sometimes both the pessimist and the optimist. One thing I noticed, I wonder if you comment on, we talked about innovation, and what I'm thinking, it's a little bit in line with Martin's observation about the value the university adds to society at large, is we're not going to have innovation unless we have innovators. And so one of the things I feel somehow we must do is we have to educate our undergraduates in a very robust and rich way so that they can become graduate students and eventually the innovators of the next generation. So I guess I'd say is the sense I got from your depiction is that the various pieces of this fabric are pulling apart, and yet somehow we can't let that happen. I wonder if you could meditate on that.
Yeah. Well, if the fabric does pull apart, it's going to happen. It's going to happen lower down in the system. It's the regional state universities are the ones that are going to have enrollment crunch. The private colleges that don't have a large endowment they're facing very, very poor financial prospects right now. That's sort of what the Moody's report predicted. So I guess in terms of the fabric ripping or whatever the metaphor is, it'll happen down there first. And of course, the research universities are best able to handle themselves. But institutions adapt incrementally, as I said before, a year at a time, and they'll do what they have to do. But if it comes to the fact that some institutions start failing or states start closing some institutions, then you'll know that it's a real crisis.
Let me ask a question that's related to that. Do you think that we have built a system that is trying to educate too many people at the university level?
I think that there are the expectations in the higher education policy community is that we can just keep educating more and more people. And there are two problems. One problem is the preparation problem. I mean, it's the K through 12 system is not preparing enough people. It prepares some people very well, but it's not preparing 75% of the students for post-secondary education. And the other problem is the community college system where relevant post-secondary credentials might be earned, but they're underfunded tremendously. And the Obama administration was correct to identify the community college as the place where everybody could get some post-secondary education, but there's no money for it. And you know that best in California, where I guess they're turning students away. So if we're going to educate this many people or more, we need to find more ways to educate them. And certainly the system that we have now, and where marketers for for-profit institutions sort of hoodwink students into signing up for loans and Pell Grants in order to take vocational courses guarantee, with these wild promises of jobs, that's not the way to go. But that's the system.
So, do you think that the silo disciplines, I'm in the social sciences, sociology, economics, where we tend to educate large numbers of people through relatively standardized courses, is that going to create innovators? Is that the way the undergraduate education is going to create people, particularly in a society where the old structures of the Fordist structures, you went to GM and you marched up through the GM ladder to eventually you became manager and then you retired for the college educated, or you went into a state bureaucracy and you spent your 30 years and you ended as a manager. Is the education that's being offered that seems to be relatively structured, you take this class, this class, this class, and you get through, you get your degree, and now you join the bureaucracy and you move up the rest of your life. That bureaucracy is exploding. It's in the corporate sector, it's mostly gone. In the government sector, it looks like it's going to be eviscerated or weakened. Is that structure, the silo disciplines marching up through that way in the university for 4 years, is that creating the people, the human capital, the innovative people that are going to have to go out there and weave careers together?
Well, probably not on the undergraduate level. I know engineering schools are putting a lot of emphasis on design and entrepreneurship even at the undergraduate level. Outside of the business school, I'm not sure business schools do that very well. It really takes graduate training, and we're developing more professional oriented master's degrees to give people graduate training that's much more oriented towards the workplace. So I think the undergraduate majors really represent kind of an intellectual base for further development, and not a ticket into the bureaucracy.
So, but what you're arguing here is that they're going to have 4 years of debt, and then they better have 2 more years of debt to get to somewhere.
Yeah, that's a real problem, and I wonder if there's huge fall off in the applications to law school. I wonder if the fact that students are graduating with so much debt is preventing the enrollments in graduate school, which is probably what we really need.
I want to push you one more step here. Mark Zuckerberg, we didn't invest in Facebook, thankfully, but so many of the founders of these young firms are actually undergraduates or just graduated, and are those role models, of those the kinds of people Zuckerberg obviously is iconic, that we need to be thinking about how we can make a UC Davis give them that kind of incentive, that kind of knowledge, that kind of go try something, be crazy while you're here. Don't worry so much about your, the 10 credit, 16 credit hours times 3 gives you enough and you're making satisfactory progress. But we need to find ways to allow them to express their innovativeness and their creativeness now. Or do we need to wait for graduates?
Well, there are a lot of programs that try to do that, and I don't know of any program that tells them to drop out and try to be like Bill Gates, but or Michael Dell. Whether that can be taught in a classroom, I don't know, but you can certainly open up the possibilities, give students a different kind of message from their education, that education isn't learning everything that's in this textbook and regurgitating it, but rather it's figuring out how to do things on your own. You know, and once students get that, they are likely to behave in a much more entrepreneurial way. So I know there are programs like that. I regard them as being very optimistic, but maybe they're probably worth trying.
Well, Roger, thank you very much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. We really appreciate it.
I don't know if it's wisdom, but there are some good questions, and I thank you for your comments.
Really appreciated you coming. And I think we're having a reception. Alicia will. Okay, great, wonderful. You're all welcome to the reception. Thank you for coming.